What happens when one of rock's most legendary bands refuses to live in the past? By 2005, Deep Purple had already survived lineup changes, musical trends, and decades of touring. Don Airey had now settled into the band, and with Rapture of the Deep Purple wasn't trying to recreate Machine Head or Perfect Strangers. They sounded heavier, darker, and more experimental. But this album would also begin one of the longest gaps between Deep Purple studio records. So how did Rapture of the Deep come together? How did it perform? And why would fans have to wait 8 years for the next album? This is the story of Rapture of the Deep. By 2005, Deep Purple had already proven that the arrival of Don Airey wasn't simply about replacing Jon Lord. Airey had now been through an entire album, a full tour, and years of playing with the band. And when Deep Purple returned to the studio for the 18th album, Rapture of the Deep, this time Airey wasn't the new guy. He was part of the machine. Released in late 2005, Rapture of the Deep was the second Deep Purple studio album to feature Airey, alongside Ian Gillan, Steve Morse, Roger Glover, and Ian Paice. It was also another important step in the evolution of the Morse era lineup. And this time, the band sounded more comfortable with itself. While 2003's Bananas had been something of a transition, Rapture of the Deep felt heavier, stranger, and more confident. The band wasn't trying to recreate the past. They were trying to sound like Deep Purple in 2005. And that distinction is important. One of the most interesting things about Rapture of the Deep is how little of it was planned. Deep Purple went into the studio without a stack of finished songs waiting to be recorded. Instead, they essentially went into the room and started playing. The band had developed this approach over decades, but by the point, this chemistry between the musicians was particularly strong. They would jam, experiment with riffs and chord progressions, and gradually discover songs inside those performances. Ian Gillan would then develop the lyrics around the music. It was spontaneous, but it wasn't careless. According to Ian Paice, the writing, arranging, and recording of the basic tracks happened remarkably quickly, roughly 3 weeks. Paice believed that speed actually helped the album because the musicians weren't overthinking the material, and Don Airey was becoming increasingly important to that process. Roger Glover later recalled that Airey had become much more confident and assertive after touring behind Bananas. In fact, it was Airey's riff that became the foundation of the title track. The album was recorded in Los Angeles at Chunky Style Studios with producer Michael Bradford, who had also produced Bananas. And the environment helped shape the sound. This was Deep Purple, who stripped down to 5 musicians who knew exactly how to play together. If Bananas was a relatively straightforward hard rock record, Rapture of the Deep pushed the band towards something darker and heavier. Don Airey described the album as considerably heavier than its predecessor, with an immediate drum and organ sound, and you can hear that immediately. Ian Paice's drums are huge. Roger Glover's bass gives the song weight. Steve Morse is all over the record, but his playing isn't simply about replacing Ritchie Blackmore. His guitar style brings a completely different vocabulary to Deep Purple. And then there's Don Airey. The Hammond organ is still there, because this is Deep Purple. But Airey also brings synthesizers, atmospheric textures, and a more modern keyboard sound. The result is a strange combination of old and new. You get the Hammond, you get the blues, you get the extended instrumental passages. But you also get modern production, heavier guitar tones, and songs that don't sound like they're desperately trying to recreate Machine Head. This may be the album's biggest strength. Deep Purple sounds like a band that knows its history without being trapped by it. The album opens with Money Talks, and it's an immediate statement of intent. It's heavy, bluesy, and aggressive, with Gillan delivering one of his more distinctive performances from this period. The song also demonstrates just how much range Gillan had. The track moves from a deep, almost spoken vocal to an extremely high scream toward the end. Then come Girls Like That, a faster, more accessible rocker. It's catchy without sounding like a desperate attempt at a radio hit. And that's really the balance Deep Purple was looking for. They still wanted songs, they just didn't want to sacrifice the band's personality to get them. One of the most underrated songs on the record is Wrong Man. It's darker and more muscular than the opening tracks, with Morse's guitar and Airey's keyboards pushing against each other. There's a sense of paranoia running through the song, and the music matches it. This is one of the places where Rapture of the Deep sounds distinctly different from the classic era Deep Purple. The riffs are heavier, the production is thicker, and the band sounds less interested in simply showing off its virtuosity and more interested in creating an atmosphere. Then comes the centerpiece, Rapture of the Deep. The title comes from nitrogen narcosis, the altered state experienced by divers at great depths, and the song itself sounds appropriately strange. The riff has an unmistakably Middle Eastern flavor, something Ian Paice specifically encouraged when Don Airey was developing the idea. The band built a song around that unusual rhythmic and melodic character, and reportedly had the basic track together extremely quickly. It's one of the best examples of what this lineup could do. Airey's keyboards are crucial. Morse's guitar adds color rather than simply dominating the track. Paice and Glover provide the foundation, and Gillan rides over the whole thing with one of those performances that reminds you why he remains such a distinctive singer. The title track became the album's promotional single, although it was never going to become another Smoke on the Water, and that was never the point. Inside your mind. One of the most interesting things about Rapture of the Deep is how often Deep Purple changes direction. Clearly, quite absurd is almost the opposite of the album's heavier material. It's reflective, melodic, and surprisingly gentle. Then you have Don't Let Go, Back to Back, and Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, which move the album back toward hard rock. But perhaps the most revealing track is MTV. The song is essentially Deep Purple commenting on the music industry and their complicated relationship with commercial success. It was also based on a real experience from Gillan's career and the band's realization that they weren't going to fit neatly into the MTV era version of what a rock band was supposed to be. It's ironic because Deep Purple had once been one of the biggest bands on the planet, but by 2005 they were veterans operating largely outside the mainstream, and they seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Junkyard Blues is another highlight. It's loose, bluesy, and wonderfully old school. There's an almost jam session quality to it, which makes sense considering how the band wrote the album. Roger Glover later recalled that the song was performed live for about a year, although it eventually disappeared from the American setlist because of what he called the classic rock syndrome. And then the album closes with Before Time Began. At more than 6 minutes, it's one of the record's more expansive pieces. It's atmospheric, progressive, and slightly mysterious. It's also a fitting ending because Rapture of the Deep isn't really an album built around obvious singles. It's an album built around musicians interacting with each other. Rapture of the Deep wasn't a commercial blockbuster, but commercially it performed respectably for a band that had been around for nearly 4 decades. The album reached top 20 in several European countries, including Germany, Finland, and Switzerland, and reached number 43 on the US Billboard Independent Albums chart. The title track was issued as a promotional single, while tracks such as Wrong Man and Girls Like That received attention during the album campaign. Critically, the response was generally positive, and one of the recurring observations was that the band sounded comfortable. That was probably the most important development. This wasn't Jon Lord's Deep Purple with a replacement keyboard player. This was a new version of Deep Purple. And by Rapture of the Deep, that new identity was becoming much clearer. Then came the real test, the tour. And Deep Purple toured extensively, very extensively. The Rapture of the Deep tour took the band around the world, including Europe, South America, India, Kazakhstan, and eventually North America. By 2007, the band had been touring the album for nearly 2 years, and something interesting happened. The audiences were huge. Don Airey later described the tour as one of the best he'd ever experienced, particularly because of the size and enthusiasm of the crowds. Even more surprising were the younger fans. Airey remembers seeing people in the first 10 rows who were only 15 or 16 years old. For a band that had formed in the late 1960s, that was remarkable. Deep Purple wasn't simply surviving on nostalgia. There was still a new generation discovering the band, and the concerts themselves became increasingly important to the group's identity. But then something unexpected happened. Deep Purple didn't immediately make another studio album, and they didn't make one a year after that, or the year after that. Rapture of the Deep was released in 2005. The next Deep Purple studio album wouldn't arrive until 2013. That's an 8-year gap between studio albums. During that time, the band continued touring, playing festivals, and performing around the world. But eventually, even Deep Purple knew they needed something new. The band had spent so long on the road behind Rapture of the Deep that the next album almost became a necessity. And when they finally returned to the studio, they decided to change the formula. They brought in a producer who wasn't simply interested in capturing Deep Purple as they were. He wanted to challenge them. His name was Bob Ezrin, and that would change everything. Because the next time Deep Purple entered the studio, they weren't just making another album. They were about to enter another chapter. A chapter that would prove this band still had something left to say. 8 years after Rapture of the Deep, Deep Purple would return with Now What? And that's where our story goes next. So check out the playlist. It should be appearing on your screen, The Story of Deep Purple. And I think I have a few Whitesnake albums that will be appearing in that interim time before I get to know what's next. But that will be next. So check it out, like, subscribe. See you in the next one.